as I'll get into, I grew up not too far from MIT, so it's kind of neat to have the opportunity to speak to you all. And my favorite topic is sort of the intersection of art and tech, as you guys will see. And I come at it more from the art side, but certainly have some background in tech as well. So I know when I'm on the sort of the audience side, I'm always interested in who it is that's presenting or what their background is. So I like to start by talking a little bit about where I come from and who I am. And then today I'll be talking about AI and ML and really just tech in general and art and where they intersect at sort of three key areas that I'm interested in. So AIML for art history. So how can we use, tech and AI and ML to explore art history and expand our understanding of art and art scholarship? I also have an interest in using AI and ML for price prediction in the art market, and I've worked on some projects in that space and done some research there. And then as someone who grew up sort of as a practicing artist, I have a lot of interest in AI and ML as an art making tool, and have written a lot about artists that are sort of on the cutting edge of using these new technologies to build art. So with that, I'll kick it off. Let's see, who am I? So as I mentioned, I grew up down the street about an hour away from MIT in Cambridge in a town called Billerica. And I grew up in a family of engineers. So my dad was an engineer, my older brother was an engineer, my younger brother was an engineer, and I was lousy at math and science. And all I wanted to do was to paint and draw. And, I just, from a very early age, that was where my passions existed. So on weekends, my dad would take me to the Museum of Fine Arts. My parents started their family pretty young and we didn't have a lot of money. But one of the things that we could do is go to the library and get passes. And I fell in love with art at a very, very young age. I think I was probably somewhere between like 5 and 7. And I just decided like, that's it. I'm going to be a painter. That's all I want to do. I want to be an artist. So we spent lots of weekends learning about history and art history in the MFA and the other local museums, which was good because I wasn't a great high school student. And I'm sure a lot of you were in order to get into MIT. But I spent all my time in the art room, and because of my portfolio, I was able to get into college, where I really flourished and turned things around academically because I could focus on my passions, which were art history and painting and printmaking and sculpture and all of these things. So that was sort of like the idyllic time in my life in the late 90s when I got to focus on art. But then, like most artists, when I graduated, I was forced to try to find a job, right? I needed to figure out how am I going to put a roof over my head and how am I going to feed myself. So I kind of went back into the family trade and worked in tech for the last 20 years, mostly at smaller companies, but some of those startups were acquired by larger companies. So I kind of gotten some experience from both sides. And what I've learned over the last 20 years is that, usually the smaller the company, the happier I am. So in the last 2 years, I've just been sort of a solo contractor doing marketing and business consulting for mostly Boston area startups. And along that way, I really missed being in a creative environment with visually creative folks and artists. So I went back to school nights to Mass Art to a program called the Dynamic Media Institute. I actually think they have an arrangement with MIT where we were able to take some classes there, and folks can take some classes, I think, at Mass Art, or at least they could back in 2007 to 2010 when I was there. But this program, unlike my undergrad, focused much more on digital art, right? So this is where I started learning about generative art and the history of generative art and information design and user design, and really had a blast there. And until recently, so I'd say over the last 10 years or so, I worked for 2 companies started by Mike Stonebreaker. So I think a lot of folks may have know of Mike Stonebreaker as professor at MIT and won the Turing Award, I guess 5 or 6 years ago. So not only did I grow up around engineers, but I've spent my entire career around tech-minded folks. And really, it was when I was at Vertica and Tamer that I started to think about how is it that we can apply some of these tools around data and data analysis and AI and ML to the world that I'm passionate about, the art world. So I had a pretty long commute from, I live in Ashland, about 3 miles off the start of the Boston Marathon route. And for the bulk of that 10 years, I was driving in an hour to Cambridge and then an hour back, sometimes longer with traffic. So I listened to a lot of audiobooks to kind of kill the time. And there's this book, Provenance, about two forgers in England that were forging paintings. And what blew my mind was that it blew my mind that they were forging these paintings that were super expensive and important to me as someone who loves art history, but they were also forging the provenance. So provenance is like the documentation of who owned the paintings and who bought it and who sold it to who. And so for someone like me that, I'm not a very religious person, but for me, art history is almost like my religion since I was at a very young age. And to learn that the art historical record was this susceptible, was like, it almost felt like someone was like rewriting my Bible. Like I was like genuinely offended and felt like I needed to do something about it. And having worked in tech and big data, I was like, well, where is the database? You would think there couldn't be forgery, because like, where would the database be that has the complete works listed by the best known artists? I mean, it's a $65 billion a year industry, right? That's pretty top heavy, selling these pretty well-known artists for hundreds of millions of dollars for a single painting in some cases, right? So there has to be an inventory or a database somewhere. And the more I read up on it, the more I read that this forgery statistic, there's something like 15 to 20% of art is either forged or misattributed on the market and in museums. This stat is hard to prove, right? There's a few stats that are out there. Some say it's as high as 50%. But I tend to put out the more conservative version for credibility purposes. But if it's anywhere near this, I think we can all agree that's a pretty large and scary number for the number of forgeries we have for what's essentially our cultural heritage, right? Our artworks. So I reached out at the time, this is maybe 6-7 years ago, I reached out to Harvard and Princeton and the Smithsonian Institute and the Getty, asking all these people via email. So I'm kind of a startup nerd. I like startups. And one of the things you learn when you try to come up with a lot of startup ideas is like, there's almost always the case that someone's already done the thing you want to do. So I reached out to all these universities, art libraries, and these institutions and said, hey, where's the database of all the best known works by the most important artists? And they all came back and said the same thing. Sadly, there's a massive gap in the research and the scholarship, and it's like really problematic. We're not sure if it's a problem that could be solved, but we'd love it if someone could. So this blew my mind because I knew that, things like Pez dispensers, those little candy things, we have like multiple databases on like how many Pez dispensers there are. And you can go find them for free online. We have multiple databases on Beanie Babies. You can go and figure out how many of those are, that there are out there, right? And we've done a decent job of keeping inventory of those. But when you go to something like Google, right, which is where I think everybody goes to get their answers today, it's like the first place people go to check. Until very recently, you could look up an artist like Mark Rothko, and if you asked, how many paintings did Rothko make, Google comes back with like at least 4. So that's obviously wrong, right? And I think it shows that that's sort of the state of where we're at in terms of data and analytics for art. I later on would go to a bunch of presentations where companies would show up touting that they had like all these art analytics, and I would kind of be like, well, how fancy can your art analytics be if we don't even have like a basic count, right? Like counting is maybe the analytic we should start with. So I was bummed out for a while about that, and eventually my family convinced me that I should try to solve the problem. So my older brother built out this PVC contraption you can kind of see in the lower left hand here with the platens in the middle, and it had sort of a counterbalance weight in the back, and I had 2 DSLR cameras coming in with a remote trigger, and it allowed me to scan these large format books. And then I looked into it, and it turns out a lot of these artists, there is a listing of their complete works, but it's in these books called catalog raisonnés, and they look almost like an encyclopedia set. They're pretty large. And what I quickly discovered is that they're super rare and hard to find. So for example, the Picasso catalog raisonné until very recently cost $200,000 and was like almost impossible to find. Someone reissued it, and now for $20,000 you can find it. So over the span of 3 years, I started scanning the metadata on all these artists, all the work, what are the dimensions, what are the materials, because there was this sort of absence of data in the art world. And after 3 years and a lot of time and a lot of money, I realized if I were to get hit by a bus or something like that, no one would have access to any of the data. Like it would all be for naught, and my goal to try to reduce forgery, wouldn't really happen. So I put together this blog called artgnome.com with the thinking that ArtGnome is like genome for art, and started putting out essays that kind of explained new analytics or ways that we could look at this data. It was pretty exciting because nobody had this data in a way that you could really run analysis on it before. So pretty much every day I was discovering new and exciting things, and sometimes pretty basic stuff, right? So this is the tallest Jackson Pollock painting, and it's in the Harvard Art Museum. And I'm pretty sure that no one in the museum even knew that they had the tallest one, because the data was just never in that format, right? When you keep your data in a printed book, it's pretty hard to run even basic analyses. And after I put out the blog post, I was lucky in that there was a fair amount of attention that came my way, and some pretty sharp folks. When you have data that no one else has, look, getting data is pretty boring. You're scanning a bunch of data and trying to clean it manually. But when you have that clean, good data source, I think a lot of people know it's a big part of data science. It's just getting the data, getting it clean, getting it organized. Other smart folks come in and want to actually do cool projects with you. So this is one of a dozen or so projects that I've done sort of with that data around Van Gogh, who I think everybody kind of knows who Van Gogh is. There's this sort of standing theory in art history that Van Gogh, early in his career, his palette was very dark, a lot of browns and blacks and ochres. And then in the second half of his career, his work shifted to be like these golden yellows that maybe people think of with the sunflowers. And art historians have written about this for a long, long time with all kinds of theories. So the two dominant theories that I'd heard about were that when Van Gogh went to France and hung out with the Impressionists had these very bright pastel colored palettes. And people said, well, it's obvious Van Gogh went and was influenced by the Impressionists, and that's why his color palette got brighter and more yellow. And then there's another theory that, so I think it's pretty well known that Van Gogh had some mental health issues that sort of escalated toward the ends of his life. And he was treated by Dr. Gachet with this plant called foxglove. And it's sort of a side effect that's known that foxglove can give you yellow vision. So some people thought that maybe it was the yellow vision from the foxglove. But what we did is we looked at every single painting, since we had them all through his career, based on every location that he had ever painted in, and created a composite, an average based on the colors from each painting from each region across his entire career. And then we went and looked, we noticed sort of a pattern that regionally they seemed to get lighter and lighter. And we went and looked at the weather data for each region that he had painted in. And it turns out it looks like there's a pretty strong pattern where there's more and more sunlight as his paintings get brighter and brighter, and less rain. And he's painting outdoors a lot of the time, right? So this is an example of a sort of a quick project we did. And I think we maybe spent better part of a Saturday, half a Sunday, put it out onto Google on my ArtGnome blog. And now it's the dominant solution. If you go to Google and you search anything around Van Gogh and yellow or color palette or change, our research is sort of the first thing that comes up, which is kind of neat. It's neat to live in an age when, if you have an idea, you can do some research, put forward, a theory, and if enough people agree, it kind of Google moves it toward the top, and it becomes more of the dominant idea. So I was pretty lucky in that early on, 538, which is a data journalism site, heard about my scanning project and came and did a photo shoot and did a story, and that kind of put me on the map. And I went from just a handful of nerds that were interested in these articles that I was writing about to getting up to 10,000, 15,000 visits a month, and more and more interesting people coming to talk to me about sort of data and what we can do with that in art. And I'm lucky that there's still interest. So this actually was in the Boston Globe Arts section last Sunday. So they kind of came and did a piece to try to figure out how I'm using this data to try to do some prediction and working with some other folks. So we'll talk about that now. And I'll share Professor Jahani, and I'll share links to to all of the different projects and the publications and stuff after via email, so you can share them with the class. So AI for art scholarship, what does that look like? Well, in 2017, and now this is where we get into AI and ML. And sometimes when I talk so much about data, people are like, well, we want, AI and ML, that's the hot, sexy stuff. Like, talk about that. We don't want to hear about data. But one of the things I learned working at Tamer is that, any AI ML project actually requires a fair amount of data to be successful, right? So the two aren't completely divorced. I did this project, the visual search engine for Edward Munch in 2017. There's a company called Clarify that makes it a little bit easier for you to train your own model if you're not super technical. And I got a little support from my younger brother, who's a software engineer. And we went through and looked at all of Munch's paintings. And the way you can use this Clarify software is you can tag, like I decided I wanted to tag all the paintings that are indoors versus outdoors, or paintings with women versus paintings with men. Paintings with people with hats or people without hats. And you can just label, say, the first 100 paintings, right? And say like, okay, this one's hat, this one's no hat, this one's woman, this one's no woman. And the model can actually, the machine learning model can go through and make guesses at all the other paintings. Like, okay, based on what you've trained me on, I think this one has a woman, or this one has a man, or this one's indoors, which as an art historian is super fascinating, right? So text-based search, fairly limited when you're working with art, but being able to visually search, super useful. And what I found that was interesting is that the machine learning model actually kind of struggles in some of the same areas where humans struggle. So this guy, when I just looked at the painting, I'm like, I don't know if this guy has a hat on. Like, it's hard to tell, right? So, I mean, I would give it like a 50% chance that maybe he has a hat. And the machine learning model actually came out about there too, and was like, yeah, I think there's like a 50% chance this guy's wearing a hat. And it wasn't until I actually looked up a photo of the guy that I learned like his hair just actually kind of looks like a hat, right? But it was interesting that there's sort of overlap and limitations sometimes. So again, my projects tend to be sort of quick fire, shorter projects, but because I'm one of the, I've got this unique interest at the intersection of art and tech, I got in pretty early on some of these things, but there are a lot of folks that have gone much deeper. So Benoit Seguin, his replica search engine, he recently got a PhD, I think a year or two ago, on building out this massive visual search engine that's been used across a really huge database. And it can do these really cool things. So in art, we know that painters always study from their masters. And sometimes, even when I was growing up, I'd go to the museum and I would draw, from a painting. So there's this sort of visual connection through history of artists learning from other artists, but there's no great way to connect them. And with this visual search engine, you're able to find threads through all of art history where someone learned from someone else, or someone drew a tree in their painting based on a tree on someone else's painting. And yeah, here's an example where an artist used his own, so this two paintings by the same artist, but you can see he's essentially reusing the same motif or theme in the trees, right, across two different paintings, and the search engine picked that up. And then John Ressig is another researcher that in 2011 did his Ukiyo.org site. So he's the first I know of to use like computer vision, and he was used for art history purposes on a large scale. He was doing it with Japanese woodblock prints. And unlike paintings, with prints, you kind of by default can have hundreds of versions of the same image, and those images can spread all over the place. So you could have, dozens of museums that have the same print. One of the things that's interesting that John Ressig found is that across the same image across multiple museums could be attributed to different artists or have different titles, right? And these are things, again, that you can't surface at human scale. So really interesting use, in my opinion, of sort of computer vision, art history wise. And he also did some work with the Frick photo archive. And I think this is an example where two different institutions had the same drawing attributed to two different artists. So a lot of opportunity, I think, in terms of scholarship, and that might be where I'm most excited to see AI and ML and how we can do a better job of taking an inventory of the work we have, figuring out who made what and where it is to protect it better. But I'm also interested in how the art market works, and if there's potential to be able to use machine learning to make predictions on pricing at a large scale. So I think if I go into present mode, I can share this. When I first started looking into prediction, I saw this green canvas project that was headed as a school project by Ahmed Hosni, who actually lives in the Boston area and is doing all kinds of interesting machine learning research still. I'll go ahead and maybe present this. Let's see if it works.
This project aims at exploring relationships between painting price evaluation and the single pixels that make it. Data was scraped from the Bluen Art Sales Index webpage. In total, we created a database of 35,000 paintings at a total valuation of $9 billion US. We utilized the Python OpenCV library to perform processing on images of the paintings. These included functions to find the most dominant color within the image, calculate average brightness across all pixels, extract the number of unique colors, image thresholding to evaluate tendency to using dark versus bright colors, calculating the relative high and low brightness ratio, detecting corners using the Harris corner detection, detecting edges using the canny edge detection method, and finally using the HAR cascade phase detection routine. Trends explored in the database included paintings produced in the 1960s recorded the highest sales. This coincides with the many artistic impulses that began to gain momentum during that period, including the explosion of consumerism and popular culture. Paintings with whites, grays, and blacks as dominant colors are most likely to have high sales value. Paintings detected with low corners are also more likely to have high sales value. Auctions of very valuable pieces tend to coincide with many successful exhibitions. In an attempt to develop a machine learning platform for pricing artwork, we created a linear regression model specifically fit for paintings by Spanish painter Pablo Picasso. We used a set of 4,000 paintings for training and another equal set for tasting. Our model reached a predicted actual price correlation of 0.58. We also built separate regression models based on single parameters as predictors. We noticed that the ratio of unique colors alone generated a relatively high correlation of 0.46 between predicted values and actual prices. Taking a log on the height and width parameters also resulted in high correlation values. This allowed us to pick the best performing parameters for our regression model. The final version of the model scored between 0.32 and 0.34.
Let's see if I can minimize that. There we go. So I shared that because that was sort of my starting point in terms of my interest, and I think Ahmed, had done really interesting research. But in AIML years, in human years, 4 or 5 years is not a long time, but in AIML years, lots has changed in terms of technology and capabilities. So I had some complete known works, and I had this interest in trying to predict prices. And it turns out another researcher in the area, Kyle Waters, a data scientist, had spent a year trying to build out a prediction model. And the two of us kind of got together and used some of my data and my thinking and knowledge of the art market with sort of his machine learning and data analysis skills. And we built out a slightly more advanced model. And actually brought Ahmed in, to help us kind of think about how to work on this. So we put out some predictions. Christie's had this Ebsworth collection auction a couple of years ago. That was one of their biggest auctions of the year. And we put out some public predictions on what our model thought the different values of some of the paintings in the auction would be worth in one of my articles. I'm not the engineer, so I can't do a great job of explaining random forest, but I can tell you that I know that one of the reasons that Kyle picked this model is because we were fairly limited in the size of the data that we had to pull from, and that this does fairly well on a smaller data set. So we made predictions for a Georgia O'Keeffe painting, a Hopper painting, a Marin painting, and Arthur Dove painting. So picked 4 based on where we thought our model was the strongest. That's a sort of a laughably small sample size, I know, but I do think it was cool that we were able to put out these public predictions, and we actually outperformed Christie's estimates in terms of where these paintings would land. So I had the opportunity to present at Christie's Art and Tech and kind of showed them our predictions or whatever, and they kind of laughed. It was fun. They were cool about it. So I had eventually written enough and expressed enough interest in sort of predictions using AI and ML that the folks over at the Harvard Data Science Review reached out to me and commissioned me to write an article and kind of dig in and look at what's the sort of state of the art in terms of academic research and in terms of private sector research around, can machines actually predict the price of art at auction, and can they do it better or worse than humans? And there was a lot of interesting findings that I learned. So one of the groups I talked to was the Thread Genius team at Sotheby's. So they were ex-Spotify. They had done a prediction algorithm around music taste for Spotify, and then went over and started the group at Sotheby's. And they explained to me that it's actually the biggest determining factor in the price was first the artist's name, but shortly after that was how many bidders there are. So, I come from an art background, and art's a visual medium, and I would have assumed that it's something to do with how the painting looked would have been the thing that was like the largest predictor. But it kind of intuitively makes sense that that's not true. So we know from like the news, if there's like a famous Mark Rothko painting that sold for like $10 million 4 years ago, if we find out that it's actually not by Mark Rothko and it's a forgery, this happens more often than people realize, it goes from being worth in a snap of a finger $10 million to essentially nothing. Now, nothing changed about the visual aspects of that painting, right? So that tells us that who the artist is, how popular they were, those are the things that actually drive the price far more than anything to do with the content of the visual aspects of the work. And then on top of that, there's, the bidders. So the other thing I looked at is, is there a threat? Will machine learning replace human appraisers? And at least from the research that I did, it doesn't look like we're at a point yet where automated valuation can outperform humans in terms of accuracy. But where it can is in scale, right? So there's only so many people that can actually appraise artworks. And if you wanted to do something like create like Zillow, right, which prices all the houses on the market, not just the ones for sale, you would need something that can evaluate, tens of thousands of artworks that people might be interested in buying, not just the number that our experts can handle. And there's no reason why you couldn't do it more regularly. So the last section here that I'm going to go into is AI and ML for making art. And there have been artists for a long time, going back to, I think Cohen starts in the early 70s, that have been interested in figuring out ways to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to create art. So Cohen had this robot that he called Aaron, that he spent, I think, 3 or 4 decades, working consistently on the same program, trying to program the robot to be able to draw different things on its own. And it started with like really primitive images, and then it worked its way up to where it could draw people, and then it understood how to draw people, in the foreground and the background, and eventually, added color. And I think for a lot of folks that have sort of the exposure to the new ideas around AI and ML, there can be questions like, well, does that really qualify for AI, ML, like what he was doing? But when you talk to folks that were researching back then, that sort of was the state of the art. He's very much in keeping with, where we were in our understandings back then. But I won't go too deep into sort of the historical folks. I'm going to jump more into the people that maybe in the last 10 years or so, people have been excited about. There's sort of been this boom in AI and ML art. And for me, it starts in 2014, 2015. So Alexander Mortvintsev, who worked for Google, was using this image classifier network and thought that he might be able to find a way to use it as sort of a super resolution tool. And I had the pleasure of being able to interview Alex a couple of years ago. And he shared this story that he kind of woke up from a nightmare in the middle of the night, and it kind of gave him this breakthrough thought, and he came in and was like playing with the images, and his goal was to kind of add additional detail through super resolution. But the details that it added were like these crazy things, right, that like no one would expect. So for a while, you were seeing these images everywhere of like puppies growing out of people's faces and birds growing out of people's faces. And I know when I first saw it, as someone with an art background, I was like, wow, these are like Salvador Dali on steroids, like, really miraculous how much detail and how surreal these things are. And then the apps came out, and so this is one that I made of my wife. It went from being a thing that you could only create if you were highly technical, to something that anybody on their phone could just hit buttons and turn, all of their photos into like puppies coming out of people's faces and buildings and stuff. So the reason you get the puppies in the buildings is because it uses the ImageNet database, which was largely trained around some things like birds and dogs and architecture, cars, I think is the other one. So those tend to be the things that it kind of finds and surfaces. So I asked Alex, I was like, do you regret at all, from maybe like an artistic perspective, that because you made this so widely available, it kind of saturated the market? There was like a 2 or 3 month thing where everybody was talking about this, and then everyone was kind of sick of it, right? And he corrected me and said, well, as the person who invented this, he still doesn't understand fully how it works. There's lots more to be done with it, like from a research angle, and he's still doing a lot of work with it. So it's really my lack of technical expertise, he sort of corrected me, that made it seem like it was no longer interesting. And that there were a lot of people that had emailed him and said they'd gone into AI and ML because they had, initially had seen Deep Dream. So it's just an interesting, another perspective. So I'm looking at these things artistically, and I'm like, is this interesting artistically or not? And after Deep Dream, I feel like we kind of went into a lull. There were a lot of articles out that were talking about style transfer. So style transfer at a high level, you can take 2 photos and apply the style of one photo to the other. So in this case, I've got Van Gogh's sunflowers, and then I've got a photo of my dog Frida in the middle, who I'm very glad has been quiet through this whole presentation so far, knock on wood. And I'm applying the sunflower style to my dog Frida. Artistically, not that exciting to me, like, at least the early work that people were doing with style transfer. So I honestly kind of lost interest for a couple of years, thinking like, Deep Dream was kind of cool, and then style transfer, I don't know, not all that exciting. And then something happened in 2018. So I saw for the first time Robbie Barrett's art, and my mind was just immediately blown. I think maybe if you're a chef, you spend your whole life trying to find new flavor profiles. And if you're an artist and an art historian, you're always kind of trying to find something you haven't seen before, something that just feels completely new and expressive and emotional. So Robbie was at the time an 18-year-old high school student from like Virginia, who had like an internship at NVIDIA. So he had access to these, crazy supercomputers, and had read up early research on GANs. It's a little tough. I always try to figure out if I should go into GANs or not. I think Professor Jahanian gave an overview of GANs right before my presentation. I don't know if everyone was on.
You can go into GANs.
What's that?
You can go into GANs. We've had several talks that have like had GANs like be the primary focus.
Yeah, so I don't know. Then if you've had the talks, then I probably don't have to describe it, which is actually a good thing, because it's not that easy to describe. A lot of people talk about the sort of the forger and the producer. So someone produces something, and then there's the second network that has to try to detect the forgery. At a high level, I think the important thing to know here is that if you use a GAN and you have a bunch of training material, right? So a bunch of images that you feed it as training material, and you just, if it did everything perfectly, what would come out the other end of that GAN would be something that looks kind of like the stuff that came in. Like, that's the point of the training material, right? So if I put 1,000 photos of people's heads in, and the GAN got, through enough cycles, got really good, you would see a head that looks just like the stuff that came in. So there's a site called like This Person Doesn't Exist that does just that, right? But how important or exciting or interesting or innovative is that from an artistic perspective? I don't think it's that interesting, because you've essentially just created something that looks like stuff that went into it, right? And where I think GANs get interesting with someone like Robbie is, well, A, the curation. So what images are you putting in? So he's putting in nude portraits at this point. B, when do you stop it, right? So stopping it early produces sort of these what are errors, but like beautiful errors. And then C, how do you curate what comes out, right? And I think that's maybe where Robbie's work really stands out for me. So he also did some landscapes. And as an early digital art collector, I was lucky enough to add a bunch of these to my collection. People may have seen they've been selling for like hundreds of thousands of dollars now, because the world's come around to understanding that, like, his work's pretty brilliant. And a big thing in the news a few years ago, there was this trio in France called Obvious, who were trying to do a startup and kind of fund the startup. They didn't really have an art background, and they kind of pressured Robbie into like answering a bunch of their questions, basically stole his model, and made this work that sold at Christie's for $450,000. So there was this big, to do about like, hey, what's the right amount of credit when you're doing, software art or GANs? Like, should they have to credit Ian Goodfellow, who kind of came up with GANs, or Sumit Shantala, who did the Python implementation of it? Or did they stop at having to credit, Robbie? And I think generally people feel like, it was a little bit of a flub on Christie's part. And I kind of applied. So they invited me to lecture when they were going to do this sale, and I didn't have the opportunity to go in because I had a conflict. And I was kind of encouraged that they were going into the tech space with art because the art world's so slow to do that. But at the same time, it was clear that they just lacked the expertise. There's nothing in traditional art history training that would really prepare you to kind of speak intelligently and know this market well. So I kind of became one of the folks that got tapped to do that kind of stuff, because even though my background's in art, I've spent a lot of time around engineers and people that know AI and ML. So I started getting to do shows around the world with some of these better known and fairly accomplished GAN artists, AI artists, generative artists. One of the things people don't always realize is this stuff isn't new, right? There's like a history that goes back to the 60s, and the art world's just done a crappy job of acknowledging it. So this was a show that I got to do in Zurich, Switzerland. That's Robbie Barrett on the left at age 19, and Herbert Franke, who I think coined the term generative art, at age 91 next to him. So pretty cool to be able to do a show that has like this comprehensive, generative art list of amazing artists. So co-curated with George Bach. That's Mario Klingemann in the back, and Kate Voss, who owns the gallery. Again, got invited to China to kind of help spread the word about generative art. So I've gotten to travel the world quite a bit until COVID hit. And now I kind of just hang out in my messy office. But it's cool that I get to talk to folks like you guys. So, the folks that I generally promote are people like Mario Klingemann, who's been at this, for a long time, going back to early days when people were just starting to use Flash to make art. This is a work he sold at Sotheby's that shows infinite faces on both sides without repeating. Helena Sarin, who gets around sort of that boring, every GAN looks the same effect by training GANs on her own drawings and artworks, and then kind of taking them out and doing more analog manipulation with them after the fact. Memo Eaton, who has this beautiful video piece where you kind of move objects around and it uses image recognition with the GANs in real time. I'll make sure I include a link to this because it's definitely worth seeing. David Young, who I think went to MIT. There's maybe not surprisingly a lot of GAN artists who went to MIT. And on the left is a work where he's trying to see what's the minimum training you can do and still produce interesting results. Anna Ridler, who's consistently putting out really interesting work. Sugwin Chung, who I wrote about in an article that I did last year for Art in America that ended up on the cover, so that was pretty neat. But I've gone around the world lecturing, telling people that, it's not about the GAN. The story that like robots are making art now kind of took over and was like in all the major newspapers, which is sad because the thing that makes GAN art interesting isn't the machine and the decisions that it's making. It's really the human, and when the human interfaces, right, that things kind of become interesting. But I couldn't prove that out because I didn't know how to do it on my own until the tools became available and easy to use. So this is Runway ML. It's like almost like Photoshop for GANs and other AIML programs. So I decided after a few weeks of failing and just making a bunch of gunk that wasn't very interesting, which told me, yeah, it really does matter what the human does, because by default, GANs produce like pretty boring junk. I decided I wanted to mix The Simpsons and the complete works of Basquiat. And it was pretty cool. I was pretty happy with what came out of it. So you get like these things that are like half Simpson, half GAN, because I've blended together two training data sets. And if you're familiar with Basquiat's work, it's kind of neat. There's quite a few variations across them. But where is the line on making this stuff super easy for everyone to use? So Joel Simon has this project called ArtBreeder that started as GAN Breeder. And basically you can just drag a few knobs back and forth, and anybody can take a pre-trained GAN and make like new imagery, and the imagery looks pretty damn cool in the beginning, right? But rapidly, so this time last year, and I don't even know what the number is now, there were already 54 million images made. So there's this thing with generative art, algorithm-driven art, where because you can repeat it ad nauseum, it sort of kills itself off sometimes, right? Because it's only a matter of time before people can just drag a few sliders around and make their own cool thing. But how cool is it when essentially the world's flooded with it, right? We saw this in the 90s with Photoshop filters. They got overused and then they became kind of kitsch. And I think we've officially sort of jumped the shark. I get nonstop advertisements by these guys. I don't know, I feel bad kind of showing them. I'm sure there are other offenders, but they're just basically trying to capitalize on the fact that there are still people that don't realize you can produce like an infinite amount of like these images just by dragging sliders for free. So I think we're sort of on the tail end of that as an effect. But the artists who actually did like interesting things artistically, I think their work still really holds up. So I was able to write about that for Art in America last year, and I'll share this article too. I kind of covered how the tools that artists use over the last 2 decades have shaped the actual artwork that comes out. So one of the things that I was saying is that, you know, the more an effect is used by more people, the less artistic they feel. It's just the way that people tend to perceive things. And that sometimes people forget that artistic processes can be described as algorithmic long before we even had computers, right? You know, artists follow sequences, and while on the one hand, computers could reinforce the repetition of the same effect or look over and over again until it's not interesting, there are some times where it actually can be used to sort of break an artist's own sort of analog algorithm. Which leads me to some of the sort of maybe the final questions for folks like you that I hope eventually help build more tools and systems for artists. That, you know, what is it, how do we make tools that respect human work and can help drive creativity? I think one of the things that artists can do is sort of combine digital tools with analog. Sort of the inherent entropy of analog processes can kind of break these digital images out of being boring or repetitive. Tools that can easily be broken. It's almost always the case that a tool is being used wrong by the artist when something really breakthrough or interesting happens. Tools that can easily be combined with other tools, so you get this multiplier effect when they can kind of combine together. And then to the degree that it's possible, I think designing for emergence, so emergent behavior, which is pretty big in generative art. I think about like Will Wright, the guy that designed Sims, who talks about, you know, asked himself, what's the system, the simplest system that I can design that will give you the largest number of outputs? So some things to think about design-wise. Hopefully that was interesting for you guys. I know I kind of covered a lot of different territory. Like I said, I'm not a traditional researcher. I'm just an art nerd with a background in art who's really fascinated with where art and tech intersect. And I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jason. It was really interesting to see your viewpoint, and thanks for sharing it with us. Before questions, I should add one thing here, that I appreciate that you called me professor, but I'm not there yet. I'm working on it. I'm a research scientist at the moment and the instructor of this course. So I just didn't want to, just wanted to say that.
Well, I will say a lot of my work is in prediction, so maybe I was just tapping into those predictions.
No problem. Hopefully in the future. And I just didn't want to reinforce it.
Sure.
But no problem. Thank you so much. So are there questions? If anyone has questions, please let us know.
And I'll have questions.
I have a question.
For me. Yeah, shoot.
Yeah, so you mentioned the like Van Gogh theory. Are there any other like discoveries or theories that have come from data analytics like that? That was pretty interesting.
Yeah, thanks. So from our research, I think that's maybe the big one. Oh, look, Flash is telling me I have to uninstall. I think that might be one of the bigger ones. But we did a project where we decided we wanted to try to calculate abstraction. It's like, is there a way to put a number on abstraction? So I don't know. I think most folks know Piet Mondrian. Even if you don't know the name, he had like these grids with colored blocks, but he didn't start that way. He started painting very realistic trees, right? And it's not like overnight they went from trees to grids with color. That happened gradually. So we were trying to create an algorithm that could measure abstraction and chart throughout his career, looking at all his work, you know, could we find a way to measure how abstract or not abstract things were? And we came up with a pretty cool one. You can find it at ArtGnome, you know, pretty cool algorithm. But what we learned is that abstraction doesn't always mean simplification, especially in art. So if Mondrian went from lifelike complex trees to really simplified color squares, but you look at someone like Pollock, who went from fairly simple realism to really complex, visually complex spatter paintings, right? So our algorithm was fairly simple, but maybe a first step in that direction. I think it's sort of a theme in a lot of my projects that, you know, my attention span lasts about 2 weeks and then I jump to something else. But even looking at things like Rothko, right? And how much, you know, how many paintings Rothko painted, it was like something like 5 basketball courts worth of paintings or something. There's like all kinds of stuff that's just new context around how we can view artists. And I would classify the Van Gogh one sort of in that category of is there new context? Other things that I, you know, excited to look at are like, there are a lot of husband and wife artist pairs in the 20th century. And I'd be really curious to know when they meet and get married or have kids, does the amount of their production, either the husband or the wife, go up or down, and by how much, and what does that look like, and is there any consistency? Other things would be, we know, especially with 20th century, which is sort of my passion, when artists have made their first big sales. And I'm curious, I've got materials data, and I'm pretty curious as to like, do the paintings get bigger? Do the materials get more expensive? Do the paintings that were painted after they got discovered last longer because maybe the materials are higher quality, right? So there's sort of an infinite number of really cool projects. And I tend to just I've learned that it's the way my brain works. I like to poke at things and put them out there and say like, hey, this could be a thing. And I've done enough to kind of show that it might be a thing, but like, it's for someone else to run with it.
And so the other people running with those things, those like people at your analytics company?
Yeah, so there are a few people that I would say are in my analytics company. So it's depending on the time, it's like my company or my hobby. It kind of bleeds back and forth. This is the way entrepreneurship works kind of in the early stages. So I get clients periodically, but a lot of what we do is sort of free and like-minded people trying to do research. So Kyle Waters for sure has done a bunch there. I should know, crap, who's the guy that did the Mondrian one? I'll make sure I send that in the link. But they're, you know, these are generally smart students and grad students with a passion for art that are going to school for AI or ML or data science, who are excited and volunteer. They're like, hey, you know, you've got data no one else has. And I'd love to come and work with you on a project to try to figure out what we can do here, right? Whether that's prediction or art historical stuff. So if there are folks here that are interested in working with me, it's jason@artgnome.com. At some point, this may evolve more into a business. I think that'll be probably more around prediction, because that's where I could potentially see people giving us money. And, you know, there's some angel investors and folks that have reached out around that front. But if I'm honest with you, my passion is really around the art historical research side, and always happy to work with folks. My goal in the long run would be to make this data publicly available. But as you can imagine, it's a little dicey because these are books, right? And if someone got frustrated enough, they could probably sue me. My understanding is that because I'm only taking factual information, that you can't copyright facts. Otherwise, we couldn't ever talk about anything, right? Because you have this factual background. But I am happy to work, you know, dose out, you know, some of the data and, you know, with the right people on research projects, because I think that actually helps show that I'm doing this to try to progress what we know about art history more than anything else.
All right, yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for that response.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a great question.
Hi, I have a question too. So I thought predicting the price part is pretty interesting, but did I get it right that you are combining multiple heuristics, for instance, the edge detection, the mean brightness of all the pixels, and putting that somehow all together, or do you have one giant neural network?
Yeah, so Kyle, my data scientist, would be the best person to answer that in depth, but I can say that we're looking at a whole lot of things. So initially, we were looking mostly at auction data, past auction data, and painting names and dimensions and colors, and or actually, not, I should say not colors. So initially, we didn't have any image data. We were looking at like metadata because it was the easiest thing to access from sort of scraped auction houses data. And then we have been using images more recently in the last year or so to be able to access things like color changes and contrast and edge detection, like you said. So that first project that I showed the video from, that was before I had started my work with Kyle Waters on prediction. It was sort of an inspiration, and it's by Ahmed Hosni, who's doing AIML work around like CT scans now. But yeah, the idea is we want to use the metadata, we want to use image data, we want to use past sales, but we're also looking at things like the S&P 500, house sales, right? Because we think that other signals outside of just art and art history could have influence in strengthening the model. So I believe there's a few different models that Kyle's working with that he believe it's called you guys can correct me, but I think it's an ensemble model where you've got multiple models that you bring together in order to get a stronger signal. I don't know, is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
So Jason, did you have a question I thought you want to ask?
Yeah, I'm just curious. So with the other speakers, what have you guys learned so far? What's exciting? Like, I didn't have a chance. I wish I was in your class to see all the other speakers. So what's exciting, in terms of what people have been talking about at the intersection of art and AI and ML? Like, where do you guys see this space going? And, as someone who writes about this and is really excited about it, what should I be looking for?
That's a very good question. Well, please, anyone who has any answer, share with us.
I really liked the talk yesterday, the one with the two artists, but I don't know if that would be helpful in predicting things. They were talking about art and modeling nature, and they were talking about similar things with like the lack of data, specifically for a lot of life forms. Like they were trying to generate insects, and they found that they didn't have very many scientific descriptions of insects to feed into the model. So that was interesting. I don't know, does someone else want to mention a talk that they found interesting?
Yeah, do you know who the artists were by any chance? Do you remember who they were? I wonder if I know them.
I remember the name on the Zoom. It was Sophia Crespo, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought maybe when you said insects, Sophia is great. So I've got some of her work in my collection and I've had her in a few shows. Actually, I meant to include one of her works right before the call into one of the slides. So she uses Sienna types for her GAN or style transfer works. And I think it's a great, I talked about how you can use analog as a way to break away from all the digital work looking the same. So this is like one of my favorite works of hers that I've got. Let's see,
Wait, I think that's the body without organs one.
What's that?
We got her to kind of drop in one specific image into the chat yesterday, and I think that was the one. It just wasn't.
Oh, awesome! Well, I'll show you a different one since you've already seen that one. But yeah, her work's really remarkable, and she's definitely one of the ones that I follow pretty closely and have had a chance to give talks with and stuff like that. So it sounds like you've done a good job of getting some of the best artists in the lecture series.
Yeah, we were lucky that some of them accepted to come and give us talk. What else, guys? What do you think? So maybe I can tell that, it was a mix of having some scholars from universities, and then of course some art practitioners. And the goal here was to really have the both sides come and give us talk, so we have a good understanding of what's going on and what are the things that um, people in both sides are looking for. So for instance, for many of people who are doing science, what is interesting is the development of the algorithms. But at the same time, of course, all of us care about the impact that it can put in the society, and also thinking about the right way and wrong way of using these things, and what are the biases that one could introduce. So because of that, I think it is important to hear the stories from art practitioners and people who are actually using these things, um, so that we don't create a bubble around us and, create things that
Yeah, I worry about that all the time. It didn't make it into this presentation, although if people read the notes on the last thank you slide, there was a part that, because I repurposed that thank you slide, about bias against women in art, and how their work sells for like 30 to 40% of what work by men sells for on the market. And it's a similar bias for people of color. And when I do my projects like this one where I'm scanning all these catalog raisonnés, right? Art history has been super sexist and racist and biased, right? And just the fact that I'm scanning, the only people that have catalog raisonnés about them for the most part are white men, right? Because it's a large undertaking, and the art establishment has sort of decided that these are the artists that were worth writing about, right? So it was actually pretty demotivating. There was a point where when I was trying to do prediction, I thought I would gather all this data, spend all this time and money in like Moneyball. I would find like this really deep secret that would find you like a 5% discount because Pollock paintings that are wider are more valuable than ones that are tall. And only my data could show that. And along the way, I discovered that, work by women sells for like 30 to 40% less, and artists of color are dramatically undervalued. And I'm like, all of my ability to find misvalued or undervalued work is silly and kind of dumb in the face of such obvious discrepancies and bias, right? So I usually use a lot of my presentation time to kind of go into that, because it does matter. And if we become more and more data driven, and these tools that are going to be trained on existing data, even the works like Robbie's or whatever that are trained on like nudes, the databases of nude paintings are largely white people, right? So I mean, there's a lot more serious repercussions when you start to use, and you guys know better than I do, but when you start to use these tools for things like, policing and stuff like that, right? But I think where artists can help is to make sure that their work addresses this, right? Call these things out as they use these tools, and use as artists, they should help kind of voice the concerns and sound the alarms that we need to be careful when we use algorithms. Where's the training data coming from? And is it just perpetuating stereotypes and biases?
Certainly, I think that one of the things that many of the scientists have been thinking, and some of them have started working on, is this idea of how to detect deep fake. And it has been mostly about the news and to some extent images. But I think that, of course, art can have its own story within that topic.
Yeah, and the two intersect sometimes. So I think it was maybe 2 years ago, Google Arts and Culture, which, I mean, I love that group. They're always putting out interesting stuff. They put out this thing where you could take a picture of yourself and it would show you the painting that looks the most like you, right? But it whitewashed everybody. I mean, everybody came out looking like, a white person, right? Because that was the data that they were pulling from. So I think just being smart about that stuff, and acknowledging it, using it as an opportunity to open up conversation and trying to figure out how you adapt those tools is important.
Certainly. Excellent. Thank you so much, Jason. It was very enlightening.